This video was brought to you by GiveWell. Emmanuel Macron is very unpopular. Now, this won't come as a surprise to many people, not least the French president himself, because he famously called France a country of regicidal monarchists, explaining that the French want to elect a king, but they would like to be able to overthrow him whenever they want. Now, Macron has been battling with low approval ratings for basically his entire presidency, but things have got particularly bad recently. And Morning Consult polling suggests that he's now one of the least popular leaders in Europe, with a miserable net approval rating of -46. So in this video, we're going to explore why Emmanuel Macron is so unpopular, and whether it actually matters. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. To get things started, we're going to examine exactly how unpopular Emmanuel Macron is. Now, the first thing we need to note is that opinion polling obviously varies, as different companies have different methodologies and so on. But regardless, the polls are mostly within the same ballpark, and crucially, the trends generally align. According to the most recent data from November and December, President Macron's approval rating sits on average at 32%, with an average disapproval of 66%. Now, EVOP's polling sits comfortably in the middle of the pack, at 33 to 67%, so we're going to be using their approval ratings going forward. Looking at Macron's approval over the course of his first and second terms so far, it paints a pretty dire picture. Because, according to EVOP, Macron has been consistently unpopular. In fact, he hasn't had a net approval since the beginning of 2018, and that's true of almost all of the polling companies we looked at. Plus, his current polling isn't even the worst that he's had during his presidency. Earlier this year, in spring, Macron's disapproval was at a high of 71%, and his approval as low as 29%. And back at the end of 2018, during the Gilets Jaunes protests, a huge 76% of respondents disapproved, while just 23% approved of him. So you get the idea. Emmanuel Macron isn't very popular at all. But why is that? To answer this, we're going to have to go through various events that correspond with the ups and downs of Macron's approval, and then take a look at his personality and other factors. Now, Macron's first year in office had its ups and downs, as his honeymoon period was quickly overcome by the realities of political office, with rows over spending cuts, resignations, and a few scandals. But it was in the summer of 2018 that he suffered a big drop in approval, due to the Benalla affair. This scandal erupted in July 2018, when Macron's top security aide, Alexandre Benalla, was identified in video footage dressed as a riot police officer and beating up protesters. The incident itself was obviously damaging, but Macron's administration's response and the ensuing parliamentary inquiries caused further damage, as Benalla's initial 2-week suspension was deemed too lenient, and the Élysée Palace was accused of trying to cover up the incident. One survey found that 73% of respondents thought that the Benalla affair had damaged Macron's image, and it was widely considered to have accelerated his already slumping approval, which fell to 31% in September 2018. Later that year saw the eruption of the Gilets Jaunes, or Yellow Vest protests, which began in opposition to the government's planned increase in fuel tax, which Macron eventually scrapped. But the movement escalated into wider anti-government protests against inequality, rising costs, and perceived neglect by the political elite. That became the biggest crisis that Macron had faced in his 18-month presidency. In late November, polls placed public support for the movement as high as 84%. And by December 2018, Macron's approval had fallen to an all-time low of just 23%. Fortunately for him though, his approval did recover after this, but it didn't reach the pre-Benalla affair levels until the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when Macron's approval rating shot up to 46% in April 2020, a month after he announced the first lockdown. Opinion polling then remained relatively stable through 2022, the year that Macron was re-elected, after which the gap between approval and disapproval began to widen once again. One of Macron's biggest challenges in his second term has been the fact that his alliance lost their parliamentary majority in the June 2022 legislative election, meaning that his ability to pass legislation was seriously hindered. A prime example of this was the government's pension reform, which, among other things, aimed to raise the statutory retirement rate from 62 to 64. Now, the reforms themselves were deeply unpopular and sparked months of widespread strikes, protests, and unrest, with opinion polling finding some 2/3 of the public were opposed to the changes. What caused even more anger, though, was that the government, in the face of the parliamentary opposition, forced the reforms through the National Assembly without a vote, using Constitutional Article 49.3, a move which was opposed by around 80% of the French public. So, after months of unrest and triggering Article 49.3, Macron's approval rating dropped to just 29%. And this is a problem that he'll have to deal with for the remainder of his term, as a lack of parliamentary majority means that his government will have to use Article 49.3 more frequently than they may have liked. For reference, it was used just once in Macron's first 5-year term, and has been used at least 13 times during his second term, in just over a year and a half. But it's not even all just about legislation. It's worth considering President Macron's personality too, and what the public actually think about him. Specifically, the perception that he's arrogant, elite, and out of touch. Now, part of this is due to his personal background. He was born to a well-to-do family, attended prestigious schools and universities, and was an investment banker before entering politics. But his image of eliteness and arrogance has also been reinforced, fairly or unfairly, by a series of incidents. For example, he famously scolded a teenager for calling him Manu. He responded to a man that said he couldn't find a job by saying, "If I crossed the street, I'd find you one," and once said that he wanted to piss off the unvaccinated. And the data speaks for itself here. A poll carried out a year into his second term found that the 3 descriptors for Macron most used by respondents were authoritarian, arrogant, and contemptuous. Meanwhile, a poll released this month found that just 1/4 of the public think that he's in touch with the concerns of the French people. But the thing is, does any of this really matter? One supposes that if Emmanuel Macron cared about being liked, he wouldn't have tried to become the French president, a job that is famously not rewarded with love and affection. On that front, he's actually doing far better than his predecessor, who left office the most unpopular president in the French Fifth Republic. Additionally, as a term-limited president leaving office in 2027, Macron doesn't need to worry about his own re-election hopes. However, this does risk him being seen as a lame duck, and if he wants a successor from his own political camp, then his own popularity and success are clearly important. Otherwise, as a man who clearly cares about his legacy, Macron risks simply becoming the occupant of the Élysée Palace who preceded Marine Le Pen. There are over 1.5 million non-profit organizations in the US, and millions more around the world. So how do you know which ones are going to make the biggest impact with your donation? Well, GiveWell was founded to help donors with that exact question. They spend tens of thousands of hours poring over independent studies and charity data to help donors direct their funds to evidence-based organizations that are saving and improving lives. In fact, GiveWell has now spent over 15 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding towards a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. That's things like bed nets for as little as $5, which can reduce the number of malaria infections in impacted regions, which with enough nets can lead to a significant drop in infections and thus boost life expectancy. Together, over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate over $1 billion, and rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 150,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. In fact, in 2019, when we sold TLDR-branded pin badges for charity, we turned to GiveWell to help select the charities that we donated to, ensuring the maximum impact of our giving. And GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. As such, you can find their research and recommendations on their website for free. You can also make tax-deductible donations to recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. Plus, if you've never donated to GiveWell's recommended charities before, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as the matching fund lasts. To claim your match, go to givewell.org, pick YouTube, and enter TLDR News at checkout. And do make sure that they know that you heard about GiveWell from TLDR to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate and find out more.